The cold was the first thing she had learned about his world. It was not the crisp, honest cold of a winter morning, which bit at the cheeks and made the blood sing. This was a deep, ancient cold, a cold that lived in the very bones of the castle. It seeped from the marble floors, radiated from the vaulted stone ceilings, and clung to the velvet draperies like a shroud. For the first year of her life as his queen, Ilara had fought it. She had ordered fires lit in every hearth until the sootfall was constant, a fine grey snow dusting every surface. She had swathed herself in furs and wools, layer upon layer, until she felt like a bundled, helpless child. But the cold was not a thing of temperature. It was a thing of substance, a presence in the halls of the night court, and its truest source was the heart of the king who ruled it. 6 days now, she had carried the small, pressed flower in a locket against her skin. A mountain crocus, its petals the color of a fading twilight sky, gathered from the high meadows of her home on her last day of freedom. It was a foolish, sentimental thing, a fragment of a life that felt more distant than the most ancient history in the castle's vast library. But it was hers. It was a testament to a son she remembered, a warmth she had once taken for granted. Today, she would give it to him. Today, she would try again to bridge the silent, frozen chasm between them. She found him where she always found him, in the map room. It was a circular chamber, its walls painted with a meticulously detailed rendering of the known world, a world he had seen change and break and reform over 1,000 years. King Kaelan stood before a great oak table, his back to her, a pillar of darkness against the flickering torchlight. He was flanked by 2 of his generals, their faces as pale and sharp as shards of ice, their ancient eyes fixed on the parchment spread before them. They were plotting troop movements along the southern border, a languid, centuries-old game of threat and posture. Ilara paused in the arched doorway, the locket suddenly heavy against her chest. The air in the room was thick with the scent of old paper, beeswax, and the unique, metallic tang of her husband's kind. It was the scent of power, of time itself. Her own scent of soap and lavender and living, breathing blood felt like a profanity here. "My king," she said. Her voice was too soft, a whisper of wind against a mountain. The generals did not move, but Kaelan's head tilted a fraction of an inch. It was his only acknowledgement. He did not turn. Ilara. The name was a simple statement of fact. He was identifying her presence, as one might identify a piece of furniture. She took a breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and stepped into the room. Her silk slippers made no sound on the polished stone. She moved to his side, a small, warm satellite orbiting a dead star. He was so tall, his presence so immense, that standing beside him felt like standing at the foot of a cliff. "I have something for you," she murmured, her gaze fixed on his hand where it rested on the map. His fingers were long and elegant, impossibly pale, the nails like polished onyx. They were the hands of an artist, a scholar, a killer. They had touched her with possessive gentleness in the dark, yet in the light of his court, they held the weight of kingdoms and left no room for her. He finally turned his head, his eyes the color of a stormy sea at dusk falling upon her. For a moment, she felt the familiar, terrifying jolt of his full attention. It was like being seen by a hawk from a great height. You knew you were utterly, completely perceived, and utterly, completely insignificant. "A gift?" he asked. There was no curiosity in his tone, only a faint, weary patience. She opened the locket, her fingers trembling slightly. The pressed flower lay within, fragile and perfect. "It is a mountain crocus. From my home. They are the first to bloom after the snows melt. They mean hope." Her explanation felt clumsy, inadequate. How could she explain the feeling of the spring sun on her face, the scent of damp earth, the joy of seeing that first splash of color against the gray rock? It was a language he did not speak. He took the locket from her. His touch was cool and dry, and where his skin met hers, she felt the warmth drain from her as if into a void. He looked at the flower for a beat, his expression unreadable. "It is delicate." He closed the locket and placed it on the table. One of his generals, with a subtle, dismissive movement, shifted a heavy inkwell, and it came to rest partially on top of the small silver oval. Kaelan had already turned back to the map. "General Valerus, you were saying?" The supply lines through the Ghostwood Pass are vulnerable. Ilara stood there, frozen. The locket, her small, desperate offering of sunlight and memory, was now just another object on a table crowded with the instruments of his power. It was less than an afterthought. She watched as he leaned forward, his shadow falling across the map of her homeland, and felt a pain so sharp and precise it was like a needle to the heart. It was the pain of realizing that you could stand beside the person you were bound to, offer him the most fragile part of your soul, and he could fail to see it, not out of malice, but out of a sheer, monumental inability to comprehend its value. She turned and walked away, the silence of her departure as profound and unnoticed as her arrival. The cold of the castle seemed to welcome her back, a familiar embrace. The night of the Blood Moon Gala arrived 3 weeks later, a torrent of crimson silk and black velvet descending upon the grand ballroom. The air, usually so still and cold, thrummed with a predatory energy. Hundreds of his kind, the ancient and the powerful, moved with a liquid grace that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling to her mortal eyes. Laughter, sharp and melodious, echoed from the high, frescoed ceilings, but it held no warmth. It was the sound of knives being sharpened. Ilara stood beside Kaelin's throne on the dais, a living statue in a gown the color of spilled wine, the heartstone of the north a diamond the size of a pigeon's egg cold against her throat. It was a cage of jewels, and she was its captive bird. Kaelin was magnificent. In his element, he was not just a king, he was a dark god. He moved among his courtiers, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, a gesture that was meant to signify her status but only served to brand her as his property. He spoke in their ancient, sibilant tongue, his voice a low murmur that she could feel vibrating through his chest into her own. His attention was a powerful, sweeping beam, and it never once settled on her. She was an accessory to his power, the most exotic of his treasures, this warm, breathing thing in a room full of beautiful, cold predators. She could feel their eyes on her, the curiosity, the faint, predatory hunger. She was a novelty. A meal that the king had, for his own unknowable reasons, chosen to spare. The loneliness was a physical presence, a suffocating weight in her chest. She smiled when Kaelin's gaze swept past her, a perfect, placid smile she had practiced in the cold silver of her mirror. She nodded to the lords and ladies who offered her curt, respectful bows that did not quite hide the contempt in their ancient eyes. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life, invisible to the one person she needed to see her. The music, a haunting melody played on strings of spun silver and harps of bone, wound around her, but she could not feel it. The wine, dark and rich in her goblet, tasted of ash. Later, in the silent expanse of their chambers, the echoes of the gala finally faded, leaving only the familiar, oppressive quiet. The fire in the hearth was a roaring inferno, but its heat could not reach the corners of the cavernous room. Kaelin was shrugging off the heavy, embroidered coat of his office, his movements fluid and economical. He seemed to carry the power of the ballroom with him, a dark aura that filled the space. Ilara stood by the tall, arched window, looking out at the perpetual twilight of the vampire lands. There were no stars here, only a bruised, purple sky and the jagged silhouettes of mountains that seemed to scrape at the heavens. "I am lonely," she said to the glass, her own reflection a pale, wavering ghost. The words hung in the air, small and fragile. She had not meant to say them, but they had escaped, forced out by the pressure that had been building inside her for months. Kaelin paused, his coat halfway to the floor. He turned to her, a faint line appearing between his brows. It was not a look of concern, but of confusion, as if she had just uttered a sentence in a language he had never heard. "Lonely," he repeated, the word sounding alien on his tongue. "You are the queen of the night court. You command 1,000 servants. You have access to jewels that mortal queens would wage wars for. The finest silks, the rarest books. You are surrounded by the most powerful beings in this world." He walked toward her, his bare feet silent on the cold stone. He stopped behind her, his presence a wall of darkness at her back. "I do not understand." And that was the heart of it. He did not understand. He was trying to solve an emotional equation with the logic of a king. He saw her status, her possessions, her physical safety, and to his mind, that was the sum of a life. The gaping hole in her heart was a variable he could not compute. "Those are things, Kaylin," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They are not company. They are not connection." "You have me," he stated, as if it were the final, irrefutable point in an argument. She finally turned from the window to face him. Her eyes, which had once shone with such life, were now clouded with a desperate, pleading sorrow. "Do I? I have the king. I have the weight of your hand on my back. I have your name. But I am not sure I have ever truly had you." He looked at her, truly looked, and she saw in his eyes a vast, ancient weariness. He was trying to see her, she thought, but it was like trying to read a poem in a language one had only just begun to learn. The meaning was lost in the translation. He sighed, a sound like stone grinding against stone. "What is it you want, Ilara? Tell me. I will give it to you." The offer, so grand and so empty, was the final cruelty. It broke something inside her. The desperate hope she had been nurturing, that tiny, fragile crocus of a feeling, withered and died. "I want a window that faces the sunrise," she said, her voice hollow. He frowned. "There is no sunrise here." "I know," she said, and the single tear that escaped and traced a path down her cheek felt like a hot, searing brand. She did not wipe it away. She wanted to remember this feeling, this final, shattering ache. It was the last truly sharp thing she would feel for a very long time. Kaylin watched the tear, his expression unreadable. He did not reach for her. After a long moment, he seemed to come to a decision. "I will have the east wing redecorated for you," he said, his voice regaining its regal authority. "New tapestries. Lighter colors. Whatever you wish. It will be done." He thought he was offering a solution. He thought he was being kind. He turned and left the room, leaving her alone with the reflection of a weeping girl in a dark window, surrounded by a kingdom of riches and a poverty of the soul so absolute it was a physical void. She stood there until the tear dried on her skin, and the path it left felt as cold as everything else. It was 6 months after the last tear she shed that he truly noticed the silence. At first, he had found it a relief. The tense, emotional weather of their shared existence had finally broken, leaving behind a placid, if cool, climate. Ilara no longer wept in the dark hours before dawn. She no longer approached him with fragile, hopeful offerings from her long-lost world. The desperate, pleading questions had ceased. The fraught silences, heavy with unspoken accusations, had been replaced by a new kind of quiet, one that was smooth, polished, and utterly empty. It was, he had thought, peace. She had become the perfect queen. She moved through the cold halls of his castle with an unnerving grace, a serene and beautiful automaton. Her days fell into a precise, unshakable rhythm. She oversaw the running of the household with a quiet efficiency that his ancient, set-in-their-ways servants found both baffling and unimpeachable. She sat by his side during the endless audiences, her posture immaculate, her expression a mask of gentle attentiveness. She was a flawless ornament, reflecting his power and prestige back at him with a cool, distant light. The friction was gone. The difficult, messy business of her humanity seemed to have been sanded away, leaving this smooth, perfect surface. Kaylin found himself observing her, not with the possessive gaze of a husband, but with the detached curiosity of a naturalist studying a strange and fascinating creature. He watched her across the cavernous dining hall, where she would sit before a plate of human food, her fork and knife moving in elegant, precise motions. She ate, but he could not recall seeing her enjoy it. She consumed what was necessary for life, no more, no less. It was a function, like breathing. What began to prickle at the edges of his consciousness, a tiny, insistent splinter under the skin of his complacency, were her hands. He started noticing them everywhere. When she sat at court, they rested in the lap of her silken gown, fingers slightly curled, perfectly still. They did not clench when a petitioner's plea was denied. They did not fidget during the long, droning reports from his spymasters. They did not reach for his own hand when he sat beside her. They were like the hands of a marble effigy on a tomb, exquisitely carved and utterly devoid of life. He remembered how they used to move, quick, expressive, fluttering like birds when she was agitated, tracing the patterns on a frosted windowpane, clenching into small, determined fists when she was resolved. Now, they were simply objects. Pale, lovely, and still. The thought was a strange one, and he dismissed it. He had ruled for 1200 years. He had seen empires rise and fall like the tide. The fleeting moods of a mortal woman, even one he had chosen to bind to his side, were beneath his notice. He had given her everything. A kingdom. Immortality, should she ever choose to accept it. His protection. If she had finally found a measure of contentment in her role, it was for the best. This quiet, this order, was what he had always craved. His life was a vast, intricate clockwork mechanism, and she had been a wild, unpredictable spring in the gears. Now, she had been tamed. The mechanism ran smoothly. But the image of her hands stayed with him. One evening, he entered her new chambers in the East Wing. He had kept his promise. The rooms were transformed. The heavy, dark tapestries had been replaced with ones depicting pastoral, sun-drenched landscapes from her homeland, scenes he had copied from the books in her library. The furniture was lighter, carved from pale silverwood. The air was filled with the scent of dried flowers, not the heady, funereal scent of lilies, but lavender and chamomile, meant to be soothing. It had been an extravagant, kingly gesture. She was sitting in a chair by the window, a book open in her lap. She had not turned a page in the hour he had been aware of her presence from down the hall. She was simply looking out at the bruised twilight sky. "Ilara," he said from the doorway. She turned her head, her movements fluid and unhurried. "My king," her voice was like soft chimes, beautiful and hollow. There was no longer any trace of hope or fear or anger in it. It was simply a sound. "The seamstress has delivered the new gowns. Are they to your liking?" It was a foolish question, a clumsy attempt to breach the placid surface of her composure. "They are very fine. The craftsmanship is excellent. Please thank her on my behalf." She looked back toward the window, her duty as conversationalist fulfilled. He felt a flicker of irritation. This was not the response he had expected, though he was not sure what he had been expecting. An argument. Tears. Gratitude. Anything would have been better than this placid, polite emptiness. The peace he had once found so refreshing now felt like a vacuum, sucking the very air from the room. He was the most powerful being in the known world, and he could not command a single, genuine emotion from the woman who slept in his bed. The thought was as infuriating as it was unsettling. He had wanted her quiet. Now he had it, and the silence was deafening. The anniversary of her arrival at the night court approached, a day he had never marked before. It had been an acquisition, a political necessity, the sealing of a treaty with a troublesome human kingdom that was now dust. But this year, the date felt significant. It felt like a deadline. He decided on a gesture so grand, so irrefutable, that it would have to break through the placid facade she had constructed. It would force a reaction. It would prove, once and for all, the depth of his generosity and the foolishness of her long-ago sadness. He summoned her to the throne room. He had dismissed the guards and the courtiers. It was just the two of them, standing in the vast, echoing space, lit by 100 candles whose flames seemed to drink the warmth from the air. He stood before the twin thrones of black obsidian, and in his hands, resting on a bed of black velvet, was the heart of the mountain. It was a diamond of impossible size and purity, pulled from the deep, dead heart of the world. Legends said it held the last light of a dying star. It pulsed with a cold, internal fire, scattering the candlelight into 1,000 fractured rainbows on the stone walls. "For you," he said, his voice resonating in the stillness. "To mark the day you became my queen." Ilara looked at the jewel. Her gaze was calm, contemplative, as if she were observing a mildly interesting geological specimen. The fire of the diamond was not reflected in her eyes. There was no gasp of astonishment, no flicker of desire, no gratitude. There was nothing. After a long moment, she lifted her gaze to his. "It is beautiful," she said, and her voice was the epitome of polite, detached appreciation. It was the voice one might use to comment on a well-arranged flower display. "Thank you, my king." She did not move to take it. She did not ask to hold it. Her hands remained clasped loosely before her, still and pale. The silence stretched, taut and agonizing. The magnificent diamond, a treasure kings had died for, lay between them, utterly failing in its purpose. It was just a cold, heavy rock. A surge of something hot and unfamiliar coiled in his gut. It was not anger. It was closer to panic. "Does it not please you?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. "I have already said that it is beautiful," she replied, her tone even, unperturbed. "What more would you have me say?" He stepped forward, closing the space between them. He could feel the faint coolness that radiated from her skin. He reached out and grasped her arm. He meant for the touch to be firm, commanding, a physical reminder of his presence, of their reality. But the flesh beneath his fingers was unnervingly passive. It was not soft and yielding, nor did it tense in opposition. It was simply there. She did not flinch from his touch. She did not lean into it. She merely stood, her body a vessel of placid obedience, her eyes fixed on his face. And in her eyes, he saw it. The abyss. It was not sadness. Sadness had color, depth, texture. This was a perfect, polished void. It was the stillness of a frozen lake, beneath which nothing lived or moved. He was staring into the face of absolute zero. He, who had commanded armies, who had conversed with gods and demons, who had lived a dozen lifetimes, felt a tremor of a fear so ancient and primal he had forgotten its name. He had silenced her pain, and in its place, he had created this. A ghost in the shape of his queen. He let go of her arm as if he had been burned, and the faint rustle of her sleeve as her arm fell back to her side was the loudest sound he had ever heard. He had wanted her to be quiet, and she had obliged. She had become so quiet she had disappeared. The panic that had seized him in the throne room did not recede. It settled deep within him, a cold, hard knot in the pit of his stomach where no feeling had resided for centuries. He, Kaelin, the unbent, the eternal, was afraid. And his fear had a face, the placid, beautiful, empty face of his wife. He began to watch her. Not as a king watches a subject, or a husband a wife, but as a hunter stalks a creature he does not understand. He became a shadow in his own home, his ancient powers of silence and stealth now bent to this new, desperate purpose. He needed to understand the geography of the emptiness he had created. He found her true sanctuary. It was not the sun-drenched chambers he had designed for her. It was a place he had forgotten existed, a derelict solarium on the far western edge of the castle, a failed experiment from a consort centuries dead who had also yearned for a sun that would not rise. The glass panes were thick with grime and cracked in places, letting in slivers of the perpetual twilight. The iron frame was bleeding rust onto the flagstones. Inside, a graveyard of forgotten flora stood in great stone urns. Withered stalks of long-dead roses, the blackened, skeletal remains of ferns, the brittle husks of vines that clung to the damp walls like ancient veins. The air was thick with the scent of dust, decay, and cold, damp earth. It was a monument to failure, to things that could not thrive in his world. And it was here that Alara came to be herself. He watched from the shadows of a crumbling archway as she moved among the dead things. Her steps were slow, reverent. She did not weep for them. She did not seem to mourn. Her fingers, those pale, still fingers, would reach out and trace the precise, delicate architecture of a withered leaf. She would gently touch a dried, thorny stem, her expression one of deep, quiet concentration. She was not seeing death. She was seeing form, shape, the final, immutable truth of a thing that had ceased to struggle. She was communing with them, finding a kinship in their silent, unchanging state. One afternoon, he watched as she knelt by an urn that held the skeletal remains of what might have been a lemon tree. A faint, citrusy scent still clung to the dried leaves. She picked up a single, curled, brown leaf and held it in the palm of her hand. She studied it for a long, silent time. He could not see her face, only the still line of her back, the slope of her shoulder. But he knew the expression she wore. It was one of calm, placid observation. He had thought her pain was the problem, a messy, human inconvenience. A flaw in the otherwise perfect jewel he had acquired. Now, watching her cradle that dead leaf as if it were a sacred relic, a terrible understanding dawned. The pain had not been the problem. The pain had been the life. It had been the sign that she was still fighting, still feeling, still reaching for the sun. He had not vanquished her pain. He had simply waited it out, with the infinite, cruel patience of an immortal, until the life that produced it had guttered and gone out. She had not found peace. She had found its opposite. She had found a home among the dead things because he had made her one of them. A shard of ice seemed to lodge itself in his own chest, a phantom pain in a heart that no longer beat. The cold of the castle, the cold he had cultivated and wielded as a weapon and a shield for a millennium, had finally found its way into her soul. And he, in his arrogance, in his monumental blindness, had held the door open for it. He remembered her face on their wedding day, frightened, yes, but vibrant, her eyes filled with a fierce, defiant life. He had seen that life as a thing to be tamed, to be brought under his control. He had succeeded. And in his success, he had destroyed the one thing in his entire, endless existence that had been truly, astonishingly alive. The silence of the solarium pressed in on him, no longer peaceful, but accusatory. It was the silence of a tomb he had built with his own hands. He decided to enter her sanctuary. The scrape of his leather boots on the flagstones was a sacrilege, a loud, living sound in a place of profound quiet. Ilara did not startle. She simply lifted her head, her hand still resting on the urn of the dead tree. She watched him approach, her eyes as placid and grey as the dusty glass panes above. There was no fear, no surprise, only a faint, clinical curiosity. He was an element that did not belong here, a disruption to the perfect stillness. He stopped a few feet from her, feeling clumsy and oversized in the delicate ruin. The air was cold, but it was a different cold from the rest of the castle. This was the cold of neglect, of things left to die. It felt more honest. He gestured vaguely at the skeletal remains of the plants. "What do you do here?" he asked. His voice was rough, too loud. She looked away from him, her gaze returning to the withered vines. "I look at the shapes," she said. Her voice was soft, without inflection. The simplicity of her answer was a physical blow. It was not an accusation. It was not a lament. It was a statement of fact, and in its devastating honesty, it laid bare the entirety of her inner world. She was no longer looking for life or beauty or hope. She was looking at the final, unchanging shapes of things that had ceased to be. He felt a desperate, unfamiliar urge to fill the silence, to say something that mattered, to prove he was more than the architect of this ruin. He pointed to a dead vine that had woven itself into the rusted ironwork of the ceiling. "It reminds me of a place," he began, his voice strained, "in Tuscany. Before it was called Tuscany. The sun there was different. Warmer. The grapes grew so thick on the vines you could smell the wine in the air before they were even picked." He was offering a piece of himself, a memory from a life so distant it felt like a dream. He was trying to bring a ghost of sunlight into this grey place. He waited, his entire being coiled in anticipation of her response. Ilara's gaze followed his pointing finger to the dead vine. She considered it for a moment, her head tilted slightly. Then she looked back at him, her eyes clear and untroubled. "I see," she said. That was all. 2 words. A polite acknowledgement that he had spoken. The information had been received, processed, and filed away without effect. There was no flicker of curiosity about this forgotten Tuscany, no question about the man he had been then. His memory, his offering of vulnerability, had struck the smooth, glassy surface of her indifference and slid off without leaving a mark. He felt a surge of helpless frustration so profound it almost choked him. He was the king of the night court, a being of immense power and will, and he had just thrown a stone into a bottomless well, listening for a splash that would never, ever come. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of the same crushing helplessness she must have felt for years, trying to reach a man who was not there. The irony was so bitter it tasted like poison. He could not command a feeling into existence. He could not buy a connection with jewels or redecorate a wing of his castle into a semblance of warmth. His power, the currency of his entire existence, was useless here. The weapons of a king, authority, wealth, intimidation, were worse than futile. They were the very instruments that had caused the damage. He needed a new language, one he had forgotten how to speak, if he had ever known it at all. Days later, he acted on a strange, desperate impulse. He dismissed the entire court. The petitioners with their endless pleas, the generals with their perpetual wars, the sycophants with their cloying praise, he sent them all away. For the first time in centuries, the great throne room was silent and empty, stripped of its function and its audience. In the center of the vast, polished floor, he had a single, small table placed. It was made of simple, unadorned dark wood. He had it set for one. Not with the golden plates and jewel-encrusted goblets of the court, but with a simple ceramic plate, a silver fork, and a linen napkin. He went to the kitchens himself, ignoring the stunned terror of his staff, and chose the food: a loaf of fresh, crusty bread, a wedge of sharp white cheese, a small bunch of purple grapes, and a single glass of red wine. Human food. Simple. Real. He went to her chambers and found her, as he knew he would, sitting by the window. "Come with me," he said. It was not a command. He did not know what it was. A request, perhaps. The word felt foreign in his mouth. She rose without question, her obedience as smooth and ingrained as breathing. He led her through the silent, echoing halls to the throne room. She stopped at the sight of the small, solitary table in the center of the immense space, a tiny island in a sea of black marble. A faint flicker of something, confusion, crossed her features before it was gone. "Sit," he said, pulling out the chair for her. She Saturday. He pushed the chair in. He then took the king's throne, not to loom over her from a distance, but simply because it was the only other seat. He sat on the edge of the obsidian monstrosity, feeling foolish and out of place. She looked at the food. She did not eat. He did not tell her to. He just sat there, in the vast, silent room, and watched her. The minutes stretched into an hour. The candle flames on the distant walls barely flickered. The silence was a living thing, a thick, heavy blanket over them both. He was learning its language now. He was learning the agony of stillness. He was forcing himself to exist in the same void he had condemned her to, and it was a more exquisite torture than any his enemies had ever devised. He fought every instinct. The instinct to command her to eat. The instinct to demand she speak. The instinct to fill the crushing silence with the sound of his own voice, with justifications or apologies or pronouncements. Instead, he did what she did. He Saturday. He waited. He existed. After an hour that felt like a century, he rose from the throne and walked to the table. He stood beside her, looking down at her still hands, resting in her lap. Slowly, tentatively, he reached down. His own hand, which had signed death warrants and held the hilts of swords, trembled slightly. He did not try to take her hand. He did not try to infuse it with his own unnatural warmth. He simply rested his fingers on the back of her hand, a touch as light as a falling leaf. Her skin was cool, as always. She did not pull away. She did not react at all. Her hand remained perfectly still beneath his. Any other time, he would have withdrawn, stung by the rejection, the lack of response. But this time, he stayed. He did not try to change it. He did not try to fix it. He simply shared it. He closed his eyes and focused on the profound, absolute stillness of her, the coolness of her skin, the vast, empty space between them. And for the first time, he was not trying to conquer the emptiness. He was just bearing witness to it, his hand resting on hers in a silent, shared vigil. It was not a connection. But it was the first time in a very long time that they had been truly, terrifyingly, in the same place. His vigil became a study. He learned the subtle cartography of her silence, the rhythms of her emptiness. He discovered that she spent hours in the royal library, a cavernous space so vast that entire sections had not seen a living footstep in his lifetime. The air smelled of dust and decaying paper, a scent he'd always found comforting. He found her there one evening, standing before a heavy lectern, a massive calfskin atlas open upon it. She was looking at a map, a hand-painted depiction of the coastal fiefdoms of her birth. He approached without a sound, his shadow falling over the faded ink of the page before she was aware of him. In the past, he would have asked what she was looking for, a clumsy intrusion into her private world. Tonight, he did not. He looked over her shoulder at the familiar coastline, a place he had known long before the cartographer who drew this map had ever been born. He pointed a single, pale finger to a jagged peninsula that jutted out into the sea. "That was an island, once," he said, his voice a low murmur, careful not to break the fragile quiet of the room. "A whole forest of cinderwood grew there, so old the trees remembered the birth of the sun. The elves of the summer court burned it to the sea to spite my father. He was not telling a story of war or victory. He was recounting a loss, a scar on the world that only he remembered. The ash fell for a month. The sky was grey from here to the Wailing Mountains. When the wind blew from the east, you could smell the smoke." He was watching her, not directly, but her reflection in the polished, dark wood of the lectern. It was a distorted, wavering image, a ghost of a ghost. And as he spoke, he saw it. A ripple. For a single, breathtaking instant, the placid surface of her reflection was disturbed. The faintest of lines appeared between her brows. The corner of her mouth, which had been set in a line of serene neutrality for over a year, tightened almost imperceptibly. It was the first uncontrolled expression he had seen on her face since the night of the Blood Moon Gala. It was gone as quickly as it came, the smooth mask settling back into place, but he had seen it. He was certain of it. For Alara, the king's words were at first just sounds, a low vibration in the dusty air. But then the word ash landed in the silent, polished emptiness of her mind. Ash. The word had a texture. It was gritty, soft. It conjured a color, gray. It was not a feeling. It was not a memory. It was a single grain of sand on a perfectly smooth surface of glass. A tiny, insignificant imperfection in the void. But it was there. And for the first time in a long, long time, she felt a flicker of something that was not nothing. It was the ghost of curiosity. A question mark drawn in smoke. An island that was no more. A grey sky. The sensation was so alien, so faint, she could not hold on to it. But it had happened. The stone he had thrown into the well had not splashed, but it had, after a very long fall, finally touched the bottom. That minuscule crack in the ice of her composure became his entire focus. It was the first sign of a thaw, and he guarded the hope it gave him like a fragile flame. He knew now that grand gestures were useless, that his power was a hindrance. The only path forward was through the careful, painful excavation of his own locked-away humanity. He had to show her the ruin of his own soul before she would ever trust him near hers. He began to speak to her in the quiet hours, not of his power or his plans, but of his past. Not the grand, sweeping histories recorded in the scrolls, but the small, forgotten moments that had shaped him. He brought her to his private chambers, a place no consort had ever been invited. The room was a museum of his long life, cluttered with artifacts and memories. He did not lecture her on their significance. He simply existed among them, and he talked. One night, as a cold rain whispered against the leaded glass, he stood before a small, tarnished silver music box. "This belonged to my younger sister," he said, his voice soft. He did not look at Alara, but at the object, his gaze turned inward across 1,000 years. Her name was Lyra. She was bright. Like a flame. She loved the mortal world, its fleeting seasons, its ridiculous, passionate songs. He paused, his long fingers tracing the tarnished filigree. She fell in love with a mortal poet. My father forbade it. She ran away with him. I never saw her again. I don't know if she grew old and died in his arms, or if my father's assassins found them on the road. He was not performing. He was not trying to elicit a reaction. He was simply stating a fact, a wound so old the scar tissue was a part of his very being. He was giving her a piece of his own loneliness, a grief that had festered in silence for centuries. He spoke of his own making, the terror and the pain of the transformation, the blinding thirst, the agony of leaving the sun behind forever. He spoke of his first love, a mortal girl in a long-forgotten kingdom, and the soul-crushing, silent agony of watching her grow old and wither while he remained unchanged. I held her when she died, he whispered to the rain-streaked window. She was so small. Her breath was like a moth beating against my hand, and then, it was gone. I swore then I would never feel that again. It is better to be stone. Stone does not break. He was confessing. Not to a crime, but to a weakness. He was explaining, without excusing, the fortress he had built around his heart, the the coldness he had cultivated as a shield. He was showing her the fear that lay beneath the crown. He fell silent, the weight of his own history heavy in the room. He felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change in the quality of the stillness. He turned from the window. Ilara was sitting in a tall-backed chair, her hands in her lap as always. But she was watching him. And on her face was a single, perfect tear. It slid from the corner of her eye and traced a slow, deliberate path down her cheek. It moved with the patient gravity of sap from a frozen tree, a tiny, liquid sign of an impossible thaw. She did not seem to be aware of it. Her expression was not one of sadness, but of profound, stunned stillness, as if her own body had betrayed her. Kaelin's heart, the dead, useless muscle in his chest, gave a painful lurch. He had an overwhelming, desperate urge to cross the room, to catch the tear on his fingertip, to prove to himself that it was real, that it was warm. But he mastered himself. He stood frozen, watching that single, miraculous drop of water slide down her pale skin. He did not move. He did not speak. He would not spook the fragile, returning life. He watched it until it reached the corner of her jaw and fell, a tiny, dark spot on the velvet of her gown. It was a sacred thing, a sacrament. For Ilara, the tear was a mystery. It had risen from a place inside her she no longer knew existed. His words had not been stories, they had been stones, dropped one by one into the deep, silent well of her consciousness. And this story of a sister, of a love lost to time, had finally touched the bottom. An ache bloomed in her chest, a deep, unfamiliar pressure. It was not the smooth, polished surface of numbness. It was rough. It was painful. She had forgotten its name, but she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and absolute, that its name was feeling. And it hurt. He found her in the dead solarium. The grey light of the perpetual dusk filtered through the grimy panes, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. She was standing before an empty urn, her fingers tracing the cracks in the cold stone. She heard his footsteps, but she did not turn. The space had become theirs, a neutral ground of shared ruin. He did not speak. He came to stand beside her, holding a small, terracotta pot in his hands. The clay was damp and dark. Inside it, nestled in black soil, was a single, impossible thing, a sprout. It was no more than two small, heart-shaped leaves on a fragile green stem. A mountain primrose. He knew this because he had dispatched his swiftest riders, his most cunning agents, across the entire continent, an act of silent, desperate conquest for this one, tiny, fragile life. He had brought a piece of her sun-drenched home into the heart of his gloom. He did not offer it to her. He did not present it as a gift. A gift could be refused. An order could be obeyed without feeling. Instead, he bent and placed the pot gently on the stone bench that ran along the wall, setting it between them. The small, defiant patch of green was a shout of color in the monochrome world. He straightened and looked at her. His ancient eyes, which had witnessed the birth and death of stars, were stripped of all artifice, all power, all pride. They were filled with a terrifying, profound vulnerability. He had taken off his armor. He was no longer a king. He was just a man, ancient and foolish and full of regret, standing in a garden he had let die. "I thought," he began, and his voice was rough, hoarse, unused to the shape of such words. He had to stop and clear his throat. "I thought, perhaps we could see if it will grow. Here." The words were simple, but they held the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. "I broke this world. I cannot fix it alone. Help me." He was not giving her a flower. He was giving her a task. A purpose. A shared future, however uncertain. He was admitting the garden was dead, and that he, the all-powerful king, did not know how to bring it back to life. Ilara's gaze moved from the impossible green of the sprout to the impossible vulnerability in his eyes. The world had been grey for so long. A flat, featureless landscape of unending twilight. Now, there was this single, tiny point of brilliant color. It drew the eye. It demanded attention. It promised something she had long ago forgotten how to want. Her hand, which had been resting on the cold, cracked stone of the urn, lifted. It trembled. Not with fear, but with a fine, shocking tremor, the palsy of returning life in a limb that has been numb for too long. Sensation, sharp and prickling, shot up her arm. Her fingers, pale and slow, moved through the cold air. She did not reach for him. She did not reach for the man who had broken her, who had ignored her pain until it had turned into this vast, silent emptiness. She reached for the fragile, living thing he had brought into their shared ruin. The space between her fingertips and the delicate green leaf was an eternity. It was a chasm of choice. To touch it was to accept the possibility of growth, and with it, the possibility of pain. To touch it was to agree to try, to feel, to risk the sun again after so long in the cold. Her finger, trembling with a life she did not recognize as her own, moved closer, closer, until it was just a breath away from the living green. The universe of their two lives held its breath, waiting. The touch, when it came, was featherlight. Her fingertip grazed the velvet softness of the primrose leaf, and the sensation that shot through her was electric, searing. It was texture. It was life. It was real. Her hand jerked back instinctively, as if the living thing had burned her, and she stood there, staring at her own traitorous finger, feeling the phantom echo of that touch singing through her nerves. Kaelan watched, every fiber of his ancient being coiled in terrified anticipation. He did not move. He did not breathe, not that he needed to, but he had forgotten even the pretense. The withdrawal of her hand felt like a death sentence, and he braced himself for the return of that terrible, placid emptiness. But then he saw it. Her hand was shaking. Not the fine tremor of before, but a violent, uncontrollable trembling that traveled up her arm and into her shoulder. Her breath, which had been so measured, so controlled for months, hitched in her chest. Once. Twice. And then she gasped, a raw, ragged sound that tore from her throat like something clawed and desperate fighting its way out of a grave. "It's," she whispered, and her voice cracked, splintered into 1,000 pieces. "It's soft." 2 words. Trivial, mundane words. But they were spoken in a voice that shook with wonder, with pain, with the terrible, overwhelming rush of sensation after an eternity of numbness. Her eyes, those grey-blue eyes that had been smooth mirrors reflecting nothing, suddenly filled. The tears came not as a single, perfect drop, but as a deluge. They spilled over her lashes and down her pale cheeks in hot, chaotic streams, and with them came the sound, a sob that was half laugh, half wail, the sound of a dam breaking, of a frozen river cracking open with the violent force of a spring thaw. She collapsed. Her legs simply gave out, and she sank to her knees on the cold flagstones, her hands flying up to cover her face. But she could not contain it. The sobs racked her slender frame, shaking her so violently that she curled forward, folding in on herself. It was not elegant. It was not beautiful. It was raw and ugly and utterly, devastatingly human. Kaelan moved without thought. He dropped to his knees beside her, the ancient king of the night court kneeling on the cold stone floor of a ruined solarium. He did not know what to do. For 1,200 years, he had commanded armies, negotiated with gods, bent the wills of nations. But this weeping, broken girl who had once been his perfect, placid queen undid him completely. "Ilara," he whispered, his voice hoarse and helpless. He reached for her, his pale hand hovering over her shaking shoulder, terrified to touch, terrified not to. She looked up at him, and her face was a ruin. Her eyes were swollen and red, her cheeks blotched and wet, her expression contorted with a pain so profound it should have killed her. But in the midst of that devastation, there was something else. Something that made his dead heart lurch with a feeling he could not name. "I can feel it," she choked out, her voice thick and broken. "Kaelan, I can feel." The words were not an accusation. They were not forgiveness. They were simply a statement of fact, delivered with the awe and terror of someone waking from a nightmare to find the world still existed. She was feeling the softness of a leaf, the hardness of the stone beneath her knees, the cold air in her lungs, the wet heat of her tears. She was feeling the crushing weight of a year of accumulated, unprocessed grief. She was feeling the ache of a heart that had been frozen and was now, agonizingly, thawing. And she was feeling him. His presence, his nearness, the terrible, complicated tangle of love and resentment and desperate, fragile hope that bound them together. Kaelan's hand finally made contact. He rested it, featherlight, on her shoulder. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into it, just slightly, a movement so small it could have been an accident. But it was not an accident. It was a choice. "I'm here," he said, and the words felt absurd, inadequate. But they were all he had. "I'm here, Ilara. I'm not leaving." She nodded, unable to speak, and he shifted closer. Slowly, carefully, as if approaching a wild, wounded thing, he wrapped his arms around her. She stiffened for a heartbeat, and he braced himself for rejection. But then, with a broken, shuddering exhale, she collapsed against him. Her face pressed into his chest, her hands clutching at the velvet of his coat, and she wept. He held her. He did not try to stop the tears or to soothe them away with empty platitudes. He simply held her, his chin resting on the top of her head, his ancient arms forming a shelter around her fragile, shaking form. He felt the dampness of her tears soaking through his shirt, the warmth of her living body pressed against his cold one, the violent rhythm of her sobs vibrating through his chest. And for the first time in a millennium, he felt a wetness on his own cheek. He was crying. The tears were cold and unfamiliar, drawn from some deep, forgotten reservoir. They fell silently, tracing paths down his pale face and into her chestnut hair. He did not sob. He did not make a sound. But the tears came, and with them, a grief so vast it encompassed centuries, for his lost sister, for his lost humanity, for every moment of warmth he had turned away from, and most of all, for the woman in his arms whom he had broken so thoroughly. They knelt there together on the cold stone floor of the dead garden, two broken things clinging to each other in the ruins they had made. The primrose sat on the bench behind them, its small green leaves trembling in an unfelt breeze, a fragile witness to the slow, painful work of resurrection. Time passed in that solarium, measured not in days but in small, hard-won victories. The primrose grew. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, but it grew. A third leaf unfurled. Then a fourth. Kaelin brought soil from her homeland, rich and dark. Ilara's hands, which had been so still for so long, learned to move again, gently pressing the earth around the roots, carefully measuring water from a clay pitcher. She did not become the girl she had been. That girl was gone, buried under a year of winter. But something new emerged. She was quieter, more careful, her joy and her pain both tempered by what she had survived. But she felt. And slowly, painstakingly, she taught him to feel as well. He came to the solarium every evening. He brought her things, not diamonds or tapestries, but small, fragile offerings. A book of poetry from her homeland. A bundle of dried herbs that smelled of summer. A story from his past, offered without pride or pretense, just the raw, honest truth of who he had been and what he had lost. She listened. And sometimes, when the story was particularly painful, she would reach out and take his hand. Her touch was tentative, wary, but it was real. One evening, as the purple twilight deepened outside the grimy glass, she spoke the words that had been building in her chest for weeks. "I don't forgive you," she said quietly, her eyes on the primrose, which now had 6 leaves and the promise of a bud. "Not yet. Maybe not ever, not completely." Kaelin felt the words like a blade, but he nodded. "I know." She turned to look at him then, and her grey-blue eyes were clear and direct. "But I'm willing to try. To see if something can grow here." She gestured to the solarium, to the single living plant in a garden of death. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the immense courage in those words. She was not offering forgiveness. She was offering something far more difficult, the chance to begin again, with full knowledge of the harm that had been done, with no guarantee of success. "That is more than I deserve," he said, his voice rough. "Yes," she agreed simply. "It is." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, small, sad, but real. It was the first smile he had seen on her face in over a year, and it broke something open in his chest. He smiled back, a hesitant, unpracticed expression on his ancient face. "Then I will spend every day earning it." She nodded and turned back to the primrose. After a moment, he shifted closer, until they sat side by side on the cold stone bench, their shoulders just barely touching. It was not closeness, not yet. But it was not the vast, frozen distance that had existed between them. It was a beginning. 3 months later, the the primrose bloomed. The bud that had formed in defiant green opened into a flower of such vivid, impossible purple that it seemed to glow in the grey light. It was small and fragile and utterly alive, a spot of fierce colour in the monochrome world. Ilara stood before it, her hand covering her mouth, tears streaming freely down her face. But these were different tears. These were tears of wonder, of gratitude, of the terrible, beautiful ache of hope fulfilled. Kaelan stood beside her, and when she reached for his hand, he took it without hesitation. Their fingers intertwined, warm and cold, mortal and immortal, broken and healing. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Yes," he agreed. But he was not looking at the flower. He was looking at her. She turned and met his gaze, and in her eyes, he saw it, not forgiveness, not yet, but something just as precious. Possibility. The fragile, trembling possibility that love could be more than possession, that warmth could exist in the cold, that two people who had hurt each other so deeply might still find a way to grow together. She leaned forward, and he met her halfway. Their foreheads touched, a point of contact as light and significant as her finger on the primrose leaf. They stood there, breathing together in the grey light, the purple flower blooming beside them. Outside, the eternal twilight pressed against the glass. But inside the solarium, for the first time in 1,000 years, there was the faint, impossible promise of spring.